After nearly 10 years of a Conservative government in Canada, the Liberal Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is charting his own course. He announced Canada will stop airstrikes against ISIL in Syria. Trudeau also pledged to re-engage with the United Nations, even boldly stating Canada's desire to sit on the UN Security Council. Here to explain what's on the agenda for Canada is CCTV's Roee Ruttenberg. And Roee, how is Canada asserting itself on the global stage right now?
Well, Anand, last year Justin Trudeau really campaigned on a message of change. Change for Canada at home and change for Canada abroad. So already in his first 100 days in office, we've seen him try to distance himself from his image, from that of his Conservative predecessor, Stephen Harper, and at times even reverse some of Harper's positions. The UN example you mentioned is a great case in point. The Harper government had effectively retreated from the international body. Trudeau seems to be running towards it, trying to secure even a voice for Canada and perhaps even a seat on the UN Security Council. He is, of course, a relatively inexperienced global politician. His first real step on the international stage was in November at the G20 summit in Turkey, and then just a few days later at APEC in Manila. At both gatherings, he defended his government's decision to bring into Canada some 25,000 Syrian refugees, and he challenged other, more experienced leaders on stage with him to follow his example. On the sidelines, Trudeau met with U.S. President Barack Obama to resolve tensions over a proposed pipeline linking the two countries. Just 1 week earlier, Obama had rejected the proposal after 7 years of reviewing it. It had been supported by both Harper and Trudeau. Well, then Trudeau announced, much to Obama's chagrin, that Ottawa would be withdrawing from the U.S.-led coalition strikes on Islamic State, something he suggested during his campaign. Canada's role there, admittedly limited, reflected Harper's more hawkish approach to global affairs, Trudeau clearly trying to paint himself with a different brush. And it's not just there. The Liberal government has cautiously distanced itself from a multilateral trans-Pacific trade agreement known as the TPP, which had been championed by the Obama administration. And last week, Ottawa lifted most sanctions against Tehran following Iran's historic agreement with world powers last year. The Harper government was opposed to that agreement. Anand?
So, Roee, what are the major foreign policy priorities for Justin Trudeau moving forward?
Well, I think first and foremost, you're going to see Trudeau try to redefine Canada's role on the global stage. We've already seen that during his first 100 days, and he's got 1,300 more days to go, so expect more of it. And we're also going to see him try to redefine what an international role on that stage means in the first place. Syria, for example, strikes or sanctuary for its people as a policy. In his throne speech, we heard him put a new focus on, quote, helping the world's poorest and most vulnerable. So you'll likely see a boost, for example, in foreign aid spending. It was slashed during the Harper days. Trudeau wants to restore it to what it was when his father was Prime Minister. And many still remember those days as the glory days of Canada and its global perception. He's also going to try to prioritize things like trade with China, perhaps even becoming the first North American country to have a free trade agreement with Beijing, which is firmly against TPP. And we'll see him trying to rewrite relations with Washington. He'll be here next month, the first Canadian Prime Minister to have a state visit in nearly 20 years, even though Ottawa is just about an hour's flight away. So that on and in itself is very telling.
Okay, thanks, Roee. That's CCTV's Roee Ruttenberg reporting. To explore Canada's changing foreign policy landscape, former Canadian ambassador to the United Nations and a distinguished fellow with the Centre for International Governance Innovation, Paul Heinbecker, joins us from Ottawa. Ambassador, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
We just heard there from our reporter that the new Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, will put an end to Canadian airstrikes in Syria. Put that into some kind of context for us. How important is that? How much of a change is it?
Well, it's a change in role, but not necessarily a change in commitment to the coalition that's led by the U.S. During the election campaign, the then opposition member of Parliament, leader of the Liberal Party, said that if elected, Canada would withdraw its F-18s and end the combat mission in Syria. And in the interim, a lot has happened, of course, but the government, the new government under Mr. Trudeau, is keeping that promise. And on February the 22nd, the F-18s, our jet planes, will be withdrawn. But we will triple the number of soldiers that will be sent to Syria or Iraq to train local militaries, particularly the Kurds, but also in Iraq. And we have increased the amount of money we're spending on aid, particularly humanitarian, but also for education and the like, up to $1.1 billion. And in addition to that, we're resettling. At the moment, we've resettled about 25,000 Syrian refugees, and undoubtedly there will be more. So there remains a strong commitment to doing something about the problem from hell, the worst crisis since the Second World War in humanitarian terms, perhaps.
So is that going to be the kind of driving motivation for Canada right now, one of its core foreign policy principles, that it's going to put more of its energy, more of its effort into humanitarian causes when we have these conflict areas like Syria, rather than get involved in combat missions?
Well, I think that's one of the conclusions you could draw from that. I'm not sure that I think each of these sort of crises will be judged on its own, so to speak, merits. And the government is certainly not ruling out getting involved in combat. One of the things about Canadian history that is sometimes forgotten is that Canada was a major participant in the First World War and in the Second World War, and indeed in the Korean War. So there is a military history that goes along with the peacekeeping history that Canada has. So it will depend, I think, on what the circumstances are when the government is confronted with one of those choices.
When we look at Justin Trudeau himself here, are we seeing a new leader in Canada who is asserting a more individual foreign policy? Is he giving notice now that Canada is just not going to follow the leadership of, say, the United States or what other NATO countries are doing? Canada's going to do what is in its best interests and what it considers to be important.
I guess having been Canadian ambassador to the UN, among other places, I guess I believe that we were already following that kind of a foreign policy. We didn't participate in the invasion of Iraq in 2003, for example. And we did participate in the UN response both to Afghanistan and to Libya. So I think that what you are seeing is rather a shift from an almost reclusive, withdrawn, isolationist in some respects, foreign policy under the previous government in Canada, the Conservative government of Mr. Harper, to a much more engaged policy in the world on the part of the Liberal government. The previous government had poor relations with Washington, poor relations with Mexico City, not the best of relations with Beijing, cool and to the point of cold actual relations with Russia, although Moscow certainly bore responsibility for that. And not very good relations with the UN, and not very good relations with the Commonwealth group of countries. And so it took, the new government has basically decided to invert all of that and is seeking better relations with Washington, and that's already underway. Better relations with Beijing, better relations with the UN, better relations with Mexico, and so on. So that what you're seeing basically is a much more diplomatic-oriented, much more engaged government on the international scene than its predecessor was.
And in that pursuit of better relations with the United Nations, this is something that you would be involved with because you've been the ambassador to the UN. Canada is now seeking a seat at the Security Council. How much of a change is that?
Well, it's quite a big change, actually. The previous government sought election in 2010 for the seat on the temporary seat on the council from 2011 to 2012, and we lost rather decisively. The international community, the membership of the UN, preferred a bankrupt Portugal to a solvent Canada at that time, partly because of the policies the attitude we manifested towards the UN, which was one of considerable criticism, and partly because we walked away from our responsibilities on climate change, and generally speaking, downplayed and degraded our relationships in Africa. So we pretty much made it impossible for ourselves to get elected. The same is also the case in the Middle East, where our foreign policy basically took its lead from the Israeli government, from the Netanyahu government, which in the process lost us a lot of support among Arab countries. And that's another area in which the current government is reviewing policy, and I would expect to see some changes there as well.
And if we look specifically at Canada's relationship with China, Canada is looking at a free trade agreement with Beijing. What impact will this have on their bilateral relationship?
Well, it's I think a free trade agreement, and a lot of people more expert than I believe free trade agreement is the next important and logical step. We have a foreign investment protection arrangement with Beijing. Canada does. We have the two countries carried out a so-called complementarity study in 2012 to see in what respects free trade would be possible. And now it's a case, I think, of following up on that. And from a Canadian perspective, of course, a free trade agreement with China brings enormous benefits, but it also brings considerable risks because of the disparity of the size. Canada is not a trivial country, but we're a population of only 35 million, and that's a very in the jungle of international relations, Canada is one of the smaller cats.
Right, and in some respects, Canada's foreign policy will remain the same. I was looking at Canadian arms sales to Saudi Arabia. There is a deal on the table. That deal will go through under Justin Trudeau. Is going to be business as usual. You know, we know that Saudi Arabia has come under strong criticism around the world for its human rights policies, but do these arms sales go through?
Well, I'm one of the people who criticize Saudi human rights policies, among many others. It's a country with an appalling record, in fact. And this is a very large sale. It's $15 billion worth of light armored vehicles. And they're somewhere between jeeps and tanks in their capabilities. And we, under the previous Conservative government, which put the emphasis on trade and trade policy, they managed somehow to persuade themselves that there was no significant human rights impact of such a sale. But for most Canadians, I think, looking at that sale, it makes them very nervous. And I don't think the last word has been said on this particular contract. The government has taken the view that a contract is a contract and it was entered into by the previous government. But still, I know that it's causing considerable reflection in the government, and that there might well be, there certainly will be going forward, a much tougher set of guidelines to follow for any future such sales.